name is Dean Thornton. I was 54 years old in October 2019, and I had spent the better part of 30 years supervising road crew for Hardin County, which means I have logged more hours outdoors in southern Illinois than most people can imagine. I know the Shawnee Corridor, the way I know the inside of my own garage. I know what lives in those woods, what moves through them at night, what leaves a track, and what leaves nothing. I say that because what comes next is going to sound like something a man invents. I need you to understand that I am not that kind of man. I still have the 3 camera cards. They sit in a tin on my workbench, the kind of tin that used to hold peppermint candy. I have not put those cards into a reader since the spring of 2020. I do not need to. I have seen what is on them enough times that the images are as clear to me as a photograph of my own face. I am telling this story now because I have run out of reasons to keep it to myself, and because the keeping of it has cost me more than the telling ever will. I got into trail cameras around 2015 or so, the way a lot of guys my age do when the knees stop cooperating with all day sits in the woods. You plant the camera, you check the card, you get the satisfaction of knowing what is walking your property without having to be the one walking it at 3 in the morning. By October 2019, I had 3 cameras running. My own camera was on my 26 acres out off County Road 7 in a gap between 2 white oaks where the deer moved through every fall without fail. Gary's camera was on his family property about 2.5 miles to the northwest, a 40-acre parcel he had inherited from his father-in-law and used mostly for turkey hunting in the spring. The 3rd camera belonged to me, on a leased timber tract about 4 miles northeast of my place that a tree company let me and a couple other guys access in exchange for keeping an eye on things. 3 cameras, 2 counties, roughly a 4-mile spread across the Shawnee Corridor, all of them set and synced to my phone's clock over the course of that first week of October. I want to be specific about the syncing because it matters later. When I set a camera, I set it by hand against my phone's time. I do this with a short piece of tape over the display, while I hold the phone next to the camera screen, and I do not stop until the minutes match. Gary thought I was obsessive about it. He said so more than once, usually in the tone of a man who finds other people's precision mildly amusing. He was not wrong. I am that way with numbers. It is what made me a decent road crew supervisor, and what makes me a lousy person to argue with about dates. October in the Shawnee is good country. Honey, the ridge hickories come in gold first, then the oaks follow, and the understory drops out, so you can start to see distance through the timber. The nights cool fast after the 2nd week, and the deer are moving because the rut is building and everybody in the woods knows it, even the animals that are not deer. I put fresh batteries in all 3 cameras the first Saturday of October, walked each site to check the angles, and went home satisfied. Gary and I planned to run the first cards around the 14th or 15th, compare the buck pictures, and decide where to hang stands before the weekend opener. I pulled my own card on the morning of October 15th because I was driving past the property anyway, and the stop cost me 10 minutes. I sat in my truck in the gravel pull-off, slid the card into my reader, and started scrolling. 28 photos over 10 days, which was about right for that gap. The first 26 were exactly what I expected. 3 does on the 5th, a 6-point on the 7th, walking from right to left at 11 in the morning, a coyote on the 12th, nose down, moving fast. Then the 27th image, and I stopped. The timestamp read 2:08 a.m., October 14th. The frame showed the gap between the two oaks, lit by the camera's infrared flash in that flat gray-white that makes everything look washed out and slightly wrong. There was a shape in the gap. It was upright. It was not a deer. A deer in a camera frame has a specific architecture, a horizontal body, legs dropping down, head either low or turned. A bear stands upright sometimes, but not like that. A bear standing upright still looks like a bear. A man looks like a man, shoulders rounded slightly, arms at a recognizable dangle, head at a human height. This shape was upright and it was large, and it did not look like any of those things in a way I could immediately pin down. The proportions were off. The shoulders were too wide for the apparent hip. The arms, if they were arms, were long in a way that I kept telling myself was a trick of the infrared, a shadow from the canopy that had pooled in a misleading way. The head, if I was reading the shape correctly, sat without a neck I could distinguish. It was just there at the top of the body, broad, ears up, or something up where ears would be on an animal that had them. I sat in the truck for a while. I told myself a bear, a large bear, maybe a 300-pound boar standing up to smell the air. That would account for the height. That would account for the width. Southern Illinois has bears, though they are not common in the Shawnee the way they once were. And a large male in October would be pushing into territory looking for food before the cold. I told myself that, and I put the card back in the case, and I drove to Gary's property. Gary was home. He met me at the door with coffee he had already poured, which was his way of saying he had seen something too, though he did not say it out loud, until I had the card reader on his kitchen table and my image pulled up on the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he slid my reader aside and pulled out his own card from a kitchen drawer, where he had already set it after pulling it that morning before I arrived. His camera caught the shape at 2:19 a.m., October 14th, 11 minutes after mine. The image was different in angle and terrain, Gary's property being more open where his camera sat at the edge of a field, but the shape in it was the same shape, upright, wide at the shoulder, long in the limb, moving northeast as far as I could read the direction from the body's orientation in the frame. My property sat southwest of Gary's. The shape in my image had been moving northeast. 11 minutes later, Gary's camera, 2.5 miles northeast of mine, caught the same shape still moving northeast. I did the math in my head without saying it out loud. 2.5 miles in 11 minutes. About 13.5 miles per hour. A running black bear can hit that? I knew that. I said it to Gary, and he nodded and looked at the images again, and neither of us said anything for a minute. "That's not running," he said finally. He was right. The shape in his image, the shape in my image, was not in the posture of a running animal. Whatever it was moving at a sustained pace, upright, covering ground the way a man covers ground at a fast walk, except that a man cannot cover 2.5 miles in 11 minutes at any kind of walk. We sat with that a while. Gary refilled the coffee. I asked him if he had put anything on his property that fall, any mineral block, any attractant, and he said no, which I already knew because we had set the cameras together. I asked him if he had seen any sign around his camera post when he pulled the card, any track, any broken branch, and he said he had not looked. We drove out to his camera together. The ground under the post was dry, the soil not holding much, and I could not find a track with any definition. There was a scrape in the dirt about 8 feet from the post that could have been anything: a deer, a hog, a man's boot dragging. I photographed it with my phone. I do not know why I still have the photograph. It is not convincing. The third camera was on the leased timber tract, 4 miles northeast of my property. If the shape had continued on its line, northeast across the corridor, it would have passed within a quarter mile of that camera's position. I had set that camera on the downhill side of a ridge, covering a trail that ran through a stand of second-growth oak and tulip poplar, the kind of trail that deer use as a travel corridor between the Shawnee's managed blocks. Gary drove with me. We pulled out of his driveway in the early afternoon and were at the timber tract by 2 o'clock. The card was in the camera, undisturbed. I pulled it and we sat in the truck on the 2-track that ran back from the gate, and I put the card in the reader. 14 images, most of them deer. One of a fox moving through at twilight. 2 of a tom turkey that had apparently decided to roost late. The last image was timed at 2:41 a.m., October 14th. 33 minutes from my camera to Gary's to the timber tract, 4 miles northeast through the Shawnee corridor. The shape in the third image was the same shape, same uprightness, same wide shoulder, same long limb. In this image, it was closer to the camera than it had been in either of the other 2, close enough that the infrared had caught what I thought, what I still think, was a texture to the upper body, a density, not smooth the way a bear's coat goes flat in an infrared image. There was something in the face, the head, the region of the image where the head was. I could not name it. I could not name it the way you cannot name a word that is on the tip of your tongue. Not because you do not know it, but because some part of you has decided not to say it. Gary looked at the third image for a long time. He looked at it longer than he had looked at the others. Then he handed the reader back to me and said he needed to get home before dark. I stayed at the timber tract for a few minutes after he left. I walked up the ridge to where the camera was mounted, and I looked at the trail it was covering. I had been on this trail dozens of times. I knew the oak at the trail's bend, the one with the double trunk, knew it was about 30 inches across at chest height, a good-sized tree by any measure. The shape in the third image had been standing near that oak. Standing next to it, the shape had been taller than the point on the trunk, where the 2 trunks split, which was about 6.5 feet off the ground. I had left a second camera card at my property, a backup card I had planned to swap in if the first was full. It was still in the camera housing, and I had been meaning to pull it all day, and had forgotten in the business of driving around. I drove home thinking I would go back for it in the morning. I got as far as my driveway, sat in the truck for a while, and then turned around and drove back. I cannot explain the decision better than that. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I did not want to leave a full card in the camera through another night. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth, and I knew it when I was driving, and I went anyway. It was full dark by the time I reached the pull-off on County Road 7, a little past 8 o'clock, which is not late by most measures, but is late for a man alone in those woods in October when the leaves are off, and the distance opens up, and there is no moon worth speaking of that night. I had a headlamp and my Browning 12-gauge that I kept behind the truck seat, loaded with 3 shells of double-aught, because I had not yet put in deer loads for the season. I had my phone, which had service only at the pull-off itself, and lost it completely the moment you dropped down off the road into the hollow. I had a jacket that was warm enough and boots that were dry. I had 300 yards to walk to the camera and 300 yards back. I took the headlamp's beam off the wide setting and ran it narrow, which is what I do when I am trying to watch the edges rather than the path. The path I know by feel. The edges are where information comes from. The first 100 yards were quiet in the normal way, leaves moving where the wind came through the gap, the distant sound of something moving in the leaf duff, a mouse or a vole. The small sounds that a woods at night is full of when everything is as it should be. I walked at a pace that was neither slow nor fast. I was not frightened. I want to be honest about that. I was aware, the way I'm aware when I am working at the edge of a road and traffic is passing. Careful, present, not frightened. The second 100 yards, I noticed the quiet. It is not that there was a sound. It is the opposite of a sound. The small movements in the leaves stopped. The vole or mouse, whatever it had been, stopped. The wind was still coming through the gap. I could feel it on my face. But the leaves were not responding to it the way leaves respond when everything underneath them is moving normally. There was a stillness that had no business being there. I stopped walking. I stood still for about 30 seconds listening. I told myself a coyote had moved through and spooked the small things because that happens, and I knew it happened, and it was a reasonable explanation for what I was hearing. I started walking again. The third 100 yards, I did not tell myself anything. I reached the camera, pulled the card, put the card in my breast pocket. I turned to go back, and I saw the shape at the tree line. It was at the southern edge of the gap, maybe 60 yards from where I was standing. I know the gap's edge at that point. There is a line of 4 oaks along the south side before the timber drops away into the lower hollow. And the 4th oak is the largest, probably 40 inches across. A tree I have used as a landmark for as long as I've walked this property. The shape was standing at the 4th oak. It was standing beside it, not behind it, beside it. And it was visible from the hips up against the lighter darkness of the sky beyond the tree line. My headlamp did not reach it. The narrow beam I was running only carried to about 40 yards in good conditions, and 60 yards of October air between me and that edge of the gap meant I was seeing it in the ambient darkness, not in my own light. I stood there. My hand was on the 12 gauges grip. I had not raised it because I could not yet say what I was looking at, and a man who has supervised outdoor work for 3 decades learns fast that you do not raise a weapon at a thing you cannot name. It was upright. The same uprightness as the images. It was not moving. It was standing at the 4th oak, and it was standing still the way a thing stands still when it is aware of you. Not the stillness of a statue, but the stillness of attention, the stillness of something deciding. The head was up. Whatever was up where the head should be was oriented toward me. The shoulder width against the trunk of the 4th oak. The trunk I knew was 40 inches across. Put the shoulder width at something I did not want to calculate. The arms, if they were arms, were down at the sides, and they were long. Long in the way that the images had suggested and that I had told myself was a trick of the infrared, and I could see now that it was not a trick. The legs, below what I could see against the sky, were in the shadow of the gap, and I could not make them out clearly. I could see enough. The smell reached me a few seconds after I stopped moving. It came across the gap on the wind, and it was not any smell I have a clean name for. It was heavy in the way that a predator's marking is heavy, musky, and sharp together, but layered underneath something else, something organic and wet, the way a wound smells, or standing water in August. It was not a bear smell. I know bear smell. It was not a hog smell, not a deer smell, not a dog smell. It was something that had all of those in it the way a chord has separate notes, and none of them were the right note, and the chord was wrong. I did not move. I am aware of how that sounds. A man with a shotgun in his hands, standing 60 yards from an unknown thing in his own woods, and he did not move. I will tell you that moving felt incorrect in a way that I cannot make more rational than that. Every instinct I had said that movement was the wrong answer. So I stood still. I breathed through my mouth because the smell was that strong. I kept my hand on the grip, and I kept my eyes on the shape at the fourth oak, and I let the silence be what it was going to be. The shape moved. Not toward me. That is the part I have told myself is important, though I am not sure why. It did not come toward me. It turned at the tree line, a slow rotation that showed me the width of the back where the front had been. And then it moved south into the timber drop, and it moved the way the images had implied it moved, upright and deliberate, and at a pace that covered ground without looking as though it was working to do so. I watched the shape move through the tree line and into the lower timber, and in about 15 seconds it was gone into the dark below the ridge. I stayed where I was for what I believe was 4 or 5 minutes, though it could have been less. Then I walked back to the pull-off. I did not run. I kept the headlamp on the path, and I kept my ears on the dark behind me and to my sides, and I did not hear anything that should not have been there. The small sounds of the woods came back slowly as I walked, not all at once, gradually, the way a room fills up with people after it has been empty. I reached the truck. I put the shotgun back behind the seat. I sat in the cab with the engine running and the heat on, and I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were steady. I do not know what to make of that. I drove home. It was a little past 9 when I got in. I did not sleep. I called Gary the next morning and told him what I'd seen. I told him about going back for the card, about the shape at the tree line, about the smell. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought I'd probably surprised a large coyote in the dark, maybe 2 of them together. And the eye plays tricks in bad light. And the cameras had probably caught a bear moving through, and the images looked worse than they were because infrared always looks worse than it is. He said this carefully, not unkindly, the way a man tries to hand someone an exit from a conversation that has gotten uncomfortable. I told him I'd considered all of that. He said he was sure I had. I did not call him again for 3 weeks. When I did, he let it go to voicemail. There is a neighbor of mine, Cal Bright, who is in his late 70s and has farmed the land east of my property since before I was born. I stopped at his place a week after the encounter, ostensibly to ask about a fence line, and partway through the conversation I mentioned that I had seen something unusual on my property in October, something upright in the gap between the oaks at night. I did not say anything else. Cal Bright listened and looked at me with an expression I have thought about since, something between recognition and the deliberate choice not to say the name of a thing. He nodded once, slow, and said, That hollow runs all the way back. Then he went back to talking about the fence. I drove to the sheriff's substation in Elizabethtown the last week of October. Deputy Harlan Moss took my account at the front desk. He was professional about it, which means he wrote down the parts he thought were his business and left out the parts he did not. He told me he would make a note if there were any reports of large predator activity in the corridor. He did not call. I did not expect him to. I sold the 26 acres in the spring of 2021. I told myself it was the right time financially, and there was some truth to that. The property taxes had gone up, and I was not using the land the way I once had. I told myself those things, and I signed the papers, and I drove away from the closing, and I didn't go back. The couple who bought it, a young family from Carbondale, paid a fair price and seemed pleased. I did not tell them about the camera or the gap or the fourth oak along the southern tree line. I have thought about that decision more than once. I cannot say I made it wrong. Gary and his wife moved to Indiana in early 2020, ostensibly for her job, which had always been the plan, more or less. He and I talked at Thanksgiving that year, briefly, about their new house and his drive to work and his daughter's school. We did not talk about October. We have not talked about it since. I am not angry at him about that. I understand what it costs to hold a thing like that in your mind, and I understand the appeal of putting distance between yourself and it, literal distance, state line distance. I chose differently, which is not the same as choosing better. I talked to a man in Missouri the following spring, someone I found through a message board who had described something similar in the Mark Twain National Forest. Another corridor, another set of camera images he could not explain. We traded emails for a while. He was a retired power line worker, about 10 years older than me, methodical in the way his account was organized. We compared timestamps and distances and terrain types. I am not saying we reached conclusions. I am saying we found enough in common to make the silence harder to justify. If you have seen something in the woods that you have not told anyone, I want you to know that I understand the reason. Leave a comment if you want. It helps to know I am not the only one talking into this particular dark. What I can tell you about the aftermath is this. I sleep differently than I did in 2018. Not badly, not in a way that would show up on any chart a doctor might run, but differently. I wake at the edge of things I do not remember when I am fully awake. I have not been in the Shawnee corridor after dark since October 15th, 2019, and I was in that corridor nearly every fall for 30 years before that. I do not go back. Not because I am certain something would happen if I did, but because I am no longer certain something would not. The trail cameras went into storage after that fall. I kept the cards. There was a period in the winter of 2019 when I looked at the 3 images almost daily, trying to see something I had missed, some feature of the shape that would resolve it into a known thing. A large man in a ghillie suit, a hunter who had wandered far from any road, a prankster who had somehow covered 4 miles of Shawnee timber at night at 7 miles an hour, and then stood in my gap at 2 a.m. for reasons of his own. I tried on each of those explanations, the way you try on a coat that is almost your size. None of them fit well enough to wear. What the cameras caught was what they caught. 3 separate sensors across 4 miles in 2 counties over 33 minutes, all registering the same upright shape, moving northeast through the corridor. The timestamps do not lie. I set them myself. The distance does not lie either. I've driven it and walked portions of it, and I know the ground. Something covered those 4 miles in 33 minutes, upright, in the dark, and then it stood in my gap at the 4th oak and looked at me across 60 yards of October air, and then it walked into the lower timber and it was gone. I do not know what it was. I am not going to tell you what it was, because I do not know, and I'm not in the business of naming things I cannot name. What I can tell you is that I am a man who has spent 30 years outdoors, and I know the difference between what belongs in those woods and what does not. The 3 cards are in the tin on my workbench. The tin is about the size of a paperback book, red, with a hinged lid that does not quite close flat anymore because the cards are stacked too high inside it. I walk past that tin every morning when I go out to the garage. I do not open it. I do not need to open it. What is in it is in me, and has been for 6 years. And I suspect it will be for whatever years come after this. I keep thinking about that shape in the 3rd image, the one from the timber tract, the one where it was closest to the camera. In that image, if you look at the region of the face long enough, there is something in it. Not a feature I can name cleanly. Not an expression I can read the way you read a face you know. Just something that makes you understand, if you sit with it long enough in a quiet room, that whatever was standing on that ridge at 2:41 in the morning was not unaware of the camera, was not unaware of much of anything. I set the lid on the tin each morning and I go about my day.